She scrubbed his floors on her knees. He walked past her every single morning without a single word, not even a glance. She was nobody. A maid drowning in debt, sleeping in a basement with no windows, working 19 hours a day just to survive. He was the most feared man in Chicago. The kind of man people disappeared for looking at wrong. She had every reason to let him die. She knew about the trap. She heard them planning it through a thin concrete wall, his own brother, whispering the exact time, the exact place, the exact way Alio Ferraro would take his last breath. All she had to do was nothing. Stay silent. Fold the laundry. Let fate run its course. But she didn't. And what she did, next one phone call, made with trembling hands, from a basement at midnight, didn't just save a man's life. It broke open the most guarded secret in that entire mansion. A secret that explained everything. The most dangerous people in this world aren't the ones with power. They're the ones with nothing left to lose and still choose to do what's right. If that hit something in you, stay with me. Like this video, drop a comment telling me, have you ever been invisible to someone who needed you most? Subscribe so you never miss a story like this. Now let's go back to where it all began.
Chicago at night is a different beast. While the city sleeps, another world thrives in windowless rooms and the basements of ordinary-looking restaurants. A world where a nod can make a man vanish. Casinos hum behind laundromats, silent shipments glide through the harbor at 3 in the morning, and real estate is purchased with bags of cash. At the center of this web sat Alio Ferraro, 36 years old. His empire, a mix of luxury hotels and shadowy operations, stretched to Miami. He was precise, ruthless, and most dangerous when he was silent. People in the underworld didn't use his name. They called him the Ghost. When he made a move, it left no trace. His estate, Greystone, was tucked away in Lake Forest, behind ancient oaks and high iron gates. Inside, the air was thick with power. Black marble floors, dim light, the scent of oak and cigars. There was no laughter, only a crushing silence that spoke louder than any threat. The staff knew the rules. Don't make eye contact, don't speak, don't ask questions. To exist here was to be invisible. But one man was exempt from those rules. Hugo Caruso, 40 years old, with salt and pepper hair and hands that had buried secrets. Hugo was Alio's right hand, loyal since Alio was a wounded 20-year-old, long before he became the boss. Hugo was the only one who could enter Alio's office without knocking, the only one who dared to disagree. He was also the only one who knew Alio slipped away each night to a small, private room on the second floor, a place no one else could enter. Hugo never asked why. Hugo's loyalty wasn't bought. It was forged 17 years ago, the night Alio, his face bloody and his hands shaking, pulled him from the chaos of a family purge and said, "Live. I need you." In a house built on fear, Hugo was the only piece of trust Alio allowed himself. But even Hugo didn't know the secret behind the locked door at the end of the second-floor hallway. Behind that door was the one thing the ghost kept entirely for himself. That room was just steps from Alio's bedroom, yet it was a world away. There was no sign, no special lock, just a dark oak door that everyone knew was forbidden territory. To cross it was to sign your own death warrant. Alio carried the only key, always in his suit pocket, close to his heart. The room inside was a complete contrast to the cold luxury of the mansion. It was simple, almost bare. A small wooden table, a single white candle in a silver holder, and on a piece of black velvet, an old music box. Made of walnut, with faded carvings and greening brass hinges, it was financially worthless. But to Alio Ferraro, it was priceless. It had belonged to his mother, Catherine Ferraro. The memory was sharp, even after 28 years. He was 8, his hand in his mother's on a crisp autumn day in Wicker Park. The air smelled of coffee and falling leaves. Catherine spotted the music box in a dusty antique shop. When she opened it, A soft, sorrowful melody filled the air. She knelt down, her smile one he'd never forget. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. "It's a lullaby. Whenever you're scared, I'll play it, and you'll know I'm here." From then on, it was their nightly ritual. She would sit by his bed, open the box, and hum along. It was their secret world, free from the shadows of his father's life. Then came the night he turned 19. The purge. They kicked the door in just after midnight. Catherine shoved him behind her as he tried to shield her. A blade caught his jaw, and blood streamed down his shirt. Then, a single gunshot. Catherine fell, her hand still locked with his, until the warmth slowly faded, and his world ended right there on the floor. His father, Paolo Ferraro, survived, but was never the same, dying in his sleep 6 years later. He left everything to Alio, who was only 25, consumed by hate. Alio built an empire from the ashes, turning pain into power. Every night, after the mansion fell silent, he would unlock that door, light the candle, and open the music box. The melody would rise, and he would sit alone in the dark. Not the boss, not the ghost, but just a son who missed his mother. That was the man she came to work for, a quiet girl drowning in debt, stepping through the iron gates of a mansion ruled by a ghost, never knowing she would be the only one to see the man inside. One comforted him. Alio was the only one who truly understood what that night had cost them, because his mother gave him a small music box just before she died. A box that played a soft, sad song he would listen to every night in his locked room. It was the only thing that allowed him to remember her, and Al in the quiet after the storm. With his brother Tristan finally exposed and broken, Alio Ferraro stood by the window, the faint melody of a music box whispering into the room. He wasn't the ghost of Chicago anymore. He was just a man who had protected the last piece of his heart. That box was the only thing left of his mother, a secret anchor to the boy he was before her blood stained his face. Revealing that pain would have been a death sentence in his world, a weakness more fatal than any bullet. This was why the betrayal cut so deeply. But it wasn't just Alio who bore the scars of that night so long ago. Tristan Ferraro was only 15 when he heard the gunshot from inside an upstairs closet, hands clamped over his ears, trembling. He saw his brother afterward, cradling their mother, and in that moment, no one saw the boy hiding in the shadows. No, was the one who saw everything. This secret was Alio's armor, but it was also his biggest weakness. And Tristan, his own brother, the one he trusted most in the world, was the one who knew exactly where to strike to break him. But Alio knew more than Tristan thought. He knew about the quiet conversations, the glances exchanged when they thought he wasn't looking. He knew about the way Tristan smiled with his mouth, but never with his eyes, a mask worn every day. That cold part of Alio, the part forged in his mother's death, had been watching. So when the trap was sprung, he was ready. One reached out to him, and from that day, a fracture began to spread through the 15-year-old's soul, silent and unseen. 17 years later, at 32, Tristan played the part of the loyal younger brother flawlessly. He had a disarming warmth, a stark contrast to Alio's chilling presence, with a wide smile and a firm handshake that inspired trust. He looked like a man with no secrets, but anyone who looked closer would see the emptiness in his eyes. He managed the family's finances, expertly cleaning their money through a network of businesses, ensuring every ledger was pristine. He was brilliant, but his work went unacknowledged. In every meeting, Alio held court at the head of the table, his word law, while Tristan sat silently by his side, taking notes and executing orders. No one ever turned and asked, "What does Tristan think?" Alio commanded. Tristan complied. This was the unshakable order established by their father, Paolo. On his deathbed, Paolo had summoned only Alio, naming him heir and charging him to hold the family together. Tristan, listening from the hallway, felt the finality of his own erasure. His father never even said his name. Yet he continued to smile, to pledge his loyalty, to be the perfect subordinate. But with every slight, with every command, a silent tally was kept in the dark corners of his mind. He counted each time Alio dismissed his input. He counted each time a major decision was made without him. He counted the steps to the head of the table, a place he felt he'd earned just as much. This resentment wasn't a sudden fire. It was a slow poison, dripping steadily into his soul year after year, unnoticed by the one who drank from the same cup. And Tristan didn't just count his grievances, he quietly gathered his weapons. His first recruit was Ford Bellini. At 34, Ford was a veteran bodyguard, loyal and skilled, but perpetually overlooked. After more than a decade of service, he was still just a guard, opening doors and taking risks for men who sat at a table he could never join. Tristan recognized the familiar sting of being undervalued. He didn't need a long speech. "When I'm in charge, you'll have a seat next to me." A simple promise of power, the one thing Ford craved after 10 years of invisibility, was all it took to secure his allegiance. Perry Rizzo, the family's 30-year-old accountant, was a different case. He was sharp and ambitious, but he carried a secret. 2 years prior, he'd skimmed tens of thousands from family funds to cover a gambling debt. Perry thought he'd covered his tracks perfectly, but Tristan saw everything. He didn't need to threaten Perry, he just let him know he knew, speaking casually as if discussing the weather. "I know what happened 2 years ago. Don't worry, it's our secret. Just remember who's keeping it for you." Perry understood immediately. His loyalty now belonged to Tristan, and so the pact was sealed, a silent coup taking root right under the family's nose. Tristan was the strategist, Ford the enforcer, and Perry the key to the accounts. They moved like ghosts within the family, their alliance invisible, communicated through fleeting glances and encrypted late-night texts. And Alio, a man who saw enemies in every shadow, never suspected a thing. He trusted Tristan because they were brothers, because they were blood, and because Tristan always met his gaze with a warm smile and the words, "I'm here for you." He never heard the vow Tristan whispered alone at night, staring at the locked door of Alio's room. "You have it all now, but not for long." While this poison spread through the Ferraro home, a different kind of desperation was taking hold in another part of Chicago. A 27-year-old woman stood before the gates of the Lake Forest estate, clutching an old canvas bag. Inside was all she had left, a $95,000 debt and her mother's frayed wool scarf. Noelle Ashford, with her dark brown hair and blue-gray eyes, was gaunt from months of skipping meals, but she held her back straight, her gaze fixed. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the bag's strap. Life hadn't always been this grim. 3 years ago, she was a promising second-year nursing student at the University of Illinois at Chicago, excelling in one of the city's top programs. Her future seemed clear: graduate, get her RN license, find a good hospital job, and finally take care of her mother, Ruth. Ruth Ashford, a freelance graphic designer, was the only family Noel had. She made just enough to get by, but not enough to be secure. Her income fluctuated too much for Medicaid, yet she couldn't afford a real health insurance plan. She was trapped in the impossible gap where millions of Americans find themselves, not poor enough for help, not rich enough to survive a crisis. And then the crisis came. Stage 3 lung cancer. Ruth had never smoked a day in her life. The doctors called it bad luck, a simple betrayal by her own body. Noel can still feel the cold hospital wall against her back as she took the call, the world dissolving into a dull roar as her legs buckled. She dropped out of school that same week without a second thought. Her mother needed her. That was the only thing that mattered. She juggled 3 part-time jobs, a brutal cycle of waiting tables, running a register at CVS, and cleaning downtown offices. She survived on 4 hours of sleep and 1 meal a day, pouring every cent into her mother's care. But the medical bills were relentless. Chemotherapy, radiation, scans, medications. The debt climbed into an insurmountable tower. Still, she tried to hold it up. She borrowed from friends, then maxed out credit cards, and finally turned to the kind of lenders people pray they never have to meet. Southside loan sharks, with their crippling interest rates, were a branch of the Ferraro family's financial machine. She signed the papers in a blur, desperate for cash for her mother's emergency treatment, never knowing her name was becoming a number in a ledger. A number Perry Rizzo would record, and Tristan Ferraro would approve, neither man giving a second thought to the life attached to it. For 3 years, Noel fought alongside her mother. Some nights, Ruth was so frail, Noel feared a hug might break her. "Stop spending money on me, honey," Ruth would whisper. "I'm not going to make it." Noel would just shake her head, her tears lost in the pillow. "Don't say that. You can't leave me." But one winter morning, Ruth did leave, slipping away in her sleep. Noel held her mother's cold hand, all her tears already spent, and felt her world quietly shatter. After the funeral, what was left of her life came crashing down. $95,000 in debt, no degree, and utterly alone. The eviction notice was the final blow. Noel packed her mother's scarf into an old canvas bag and walked until she stood before the iron gates of the estate, with nowhere else left to go. She was crying for him, and Emilio Ferraro, the man Chicago called the Ghost, had no idea what to do with that. He saw that her tears weren't those of someone fearing punishment, but of someone feeling genuine pain. The realization unsettled him more than any threat, because the last person who had looked at him and seen his pain instead of his power had been his mother. When Hugo appeared at the door, his gaze took everything in. "Let me handle it, boss," he said, his voice flat. Emilio didn't turn. "No," he finally answered, the silence stretching. "She still owes. She's not going anywhere yet." But it had nothing to do with the debt. It had to do with the fact that for a brief moment, this girl saw right through him. He turned back to Noelle, his eyes cold once more. "From now on, don't look at me. Don't speak unless spoken to. And don't touch anything that's not on your list." Noelle lowered her head. "Yes, sir. Get out." She walked out on trembling legs, her hand bracing the wall for support. Behind her, the door clicked shut, the lock turning. It wasn't just a box she had broken. She understood that the moment Emilio bent down and picked up the lid, split cleanly in two. His fingers shook, just slightly, but she saw it. "Who gave you permission to come in here?" His voice was dangerously calm. "The door, it was open. I only wanted to dust," she sobbed. "I'm so sorry. Do you know what this is?" Noelle just shook her head, tears streaming. He stood, staring at the broken piece of wood as if it were a person's face. In a voice so quiet she had to hold her breath to hear, he said, "This is the only thing in my life I can't replace." Noelle kept crying, but not because she was afraid he would kill her or fire her. She cried because she understood what it was like to cling to the last piece of your mother, only to watch it shatter. She knew that feeling because she clutched a worn-out scarf every night, the same way he must have opened that box. Time seemed to stop. Noel watched the box tumble through the air, the lid springing open as it fell. She lunged for it, but she was too slow. It struck the hardwood floor not with a loud crash, but with a sound that seemed to echo like a gunshot in the silent room. The delicate mechanism inside shattered, sending tiny gears skittering across the floorboards. The melody warped, slowed, and then died, like a final breath. Noelle froze, her hand still outstretched, empty and trembling. "No," she whispered, her voice cracking. "No, no, no." She fell to her knees, frantically gathering the splintered wood and metal bits, as if holding them together could somehow bring the music back to life. But she knew it was hopeless. It couldn't be fixed. That's when she heard the heavy, slow footsteps ascending the stairs, getting closer. She looked up, her eyes blurred with tears, her hands full of broken pieces. She saw his shadow first, stretching long across the hallway floor before he appeared in the doorway. It began with the melody, The moment she opened the lid, a soft, clear, heartbreaking tune filled the small room, tightening something in her chest. It brought back a memory she thought she had locked away forever. Her mother's voice, frail but steady, singing her to sleep in the sterile quiet of the hospital. Her eyes welled up. The tears came unbidden, a silent overflow of grief that the music had unlocked. She wanted a closer look, lifting the box carefully with both hands. But her vision was clouded by tears, and her fingers, raw and tired from weeks of scrubbing, lost their grip. The maid's instinct overrode the instinct for survival. Dust, a fine layer on the doorframe, a thin coat on the threshold that hadn't been disturbed in ages. Just a quick wipe, she thought. No one will ever know. She nudged the door. It swung inward without a sound, revealing a small, dark room that smelled of old wood and candle wax. On a small table, a white candle had burned nearly to its silver holder, and there, resting on a square of black velvet, was the music box. She stepped closer. It was a small walnut box, its delicate carvings faded with time, its brass hinges tarnished. It was imperfect and old, much like her mother's wool scarf, something of little monetary value but holding an entire life within it. Something about it drew her in. Her hand reached out, touching the lid. She learned the house's unwritten laws in her first weeks. Don't enter the boss's office, don't meet his gaze, stay away from the door when guests arrive, and never ask about the men who visited late at night. Noel followed every rule. She was there to pay her debt and survive, not to make waves. But on a Wednesday afternoon, that changed. Pushing her cleaning cart down the second-floor hallway, she passed the oak door at the very end, the one she was warned to never approach. Today, however, it was ajar. A narrow gap, just a few inches wide, allowed a sliver of dim light to escape. She paused, glancing down the empty corridor. Alio and Hugo had left for a meeting downtown. Only Bree and Margot were downstairs. The house was quiet. And so, Noel Ashford walked through the iron gates of the Lake Forest estate, her canvas bag on her shoulder, and her mother's scarf tucked safely inside. It felt like entering a lavish prison, with no idea when, or if, she would ever be free. In the beginning, she was a ghost. Up before dawn to clean, scrub, and wash, she would vanish back to her room before the household truly awoke. She spoke only when necessary and never asked questions. She was just a shadow trying to work her way back into the light. The choice Hugo Caruso had offered wasn't much of a choice at all. "You owe $95,000, he had said, his eyes practical, not cruel. "You don't have it. So, you can pay somehow, or you can come work at the estate until the debt is cleared. Room and board are covered. Your pay goes to what you owe. No one will bother you." Noelle looked at him, at the worn scarf in her hands, at the taped-up window and empty refrigerator of her damp room, and saw no other path. There. She nodded. It all started after she found the cheap room in Humboldt Park. After 2 weeks in her car and a stint in a shelter, she thought she'd found a moment to breathe. But then the calls began. Debt collectors. Polite at first, then firm, then menacing. A brick shattered her window one night. The next, a note was slipped under her door. Pay up or pay another way. Trembling, she clutched her mother's old wool scarf, worn thin and faded, the lavender scent almost gone. It was the only thing she'd kept from the hospital. Pressing her face into the fabric, she whispered, "What do I do, Mom?" That was when Hugo Caruso arrived. No threats, no violence, just a man in a coat, standing outside her door with a simple, impossible proposition. It all traced back to a single moment. Hugo had looked over Alio's shoulder, assessed the situation, and offered in a low voice, "Boss, let me take care of this." Alio didn't move. A long silence passed before he finally said, "No, there's still the matter of her debt. She isn't leaving." Hugo simply nodded, asking no more questions. But if he had looked closer, he would have seen Alio's justification was a lie. The debt was irrelevant. It was about the instant he saw Noelle's tears and understood she wasn't weeping for her own fate. She was weeping for him. And Alio Ferraro, the man they called the Ghost of Chicago, was completely unprepared for that. He finally turned back to Noelle, his expression once again a mask of ice, his voice perfectly controlled. From this point on, you will not meet my gaze. You will not speak unless I speak to you first. You will not touch anything that is not on your list of duties. Noelle lowered her head. Yes, sir. Leave. She got to her feet and left the room, her legs trembling so violently she had to steady herself against the hall wall. Behind her, she heard Emilio close the door and the deadbolt slide into place. Once he was alone in the room, he slid to the floor, the fractured lid of the music box cradled in his palm. And for the first time in a very long time, there was no one to see the anguish on his face, or so he thought. Her new life began the very next morning when Hugo appeared at her first-floor room and said simply, "Get your things. You're moving to the basement." There was no explanation. None was required. Noelle grabbed her canvas bag and trailed him down the cramped stairs, through a dim hallway, to a tiny room next to the laundry. Inside was a single bed with a wafer-thin mattress, an old wooden table, and a bare bulb that cast a sickly yellow light. There were no windows, just gray concrete walls, a cold cement floor, and the constant hum of the washers next door, a damp and chilling space like a tomb. Noelle placed her bag on the bed, surveyed her new surroundings, and said nothing. She understood perfectly. This was not a room, it was a prison sentence. And from that day forward, her duties were completely transformed. She was to wake at 5 in the morning, mop the first floor, clean the kitchen, set the table for breakfast, handle the laundry, iron all the clothes, scrub the bathrooms, polish shoes, dust the living room, wipe every window, wash all the dishes, and cook whenever ordered. Her day went on and on without a break until midnight. Previously, Noelle had a structured routine like the other staff. Not anymore. Now, her job was to handle every task nobody else wanted, at any hour of the day. And it was never deemed sufficient. But the physical labor wasn't what broke Noelle's spirit. She was no stranger to hardship, having worked 3 jobs simultaneously for 3 years. Her body was conditioned to endure. The true agony was the silence. Alio never raised his voice, never berated her, never made a threat. He did something much worse. He acted as though she was not there at all. Every morning, as Noelle bowed her head and murmured, "Good morning, sir," when he passed the dining room, he would not acknowledge her, offer no reply, and never break his stride, as if she were just another fixture in the house. This confusing dynamic was the new reality. There were moments when Noelle would be cleaning a table, and if Alio entered, she had to cease her work, retreat to a corner, and stand perfectly still until he departed. It was the new rule. She was forbidden from sharing his space, unless actively performing a direct order. She had been rendered invisible. No one spoke to her, no one even glanced her way. She haunted the mansion like a ghost untouched by the sun. That silence was a deeper wound than any verbal assault, because a scream acknowledges your presence. But to be looked through, as if you were made of air, makes you question your own existence. Then, one afternoon, a small incident occurred. Noelle was clearing the dining table post-dinner, collecting plates and wine glasses. A glass, already flawed, broke in her grasp, sending a shard of glass deep into her right palm. Blood welled up instantly, a stark red against the white linen. She sucked in a sharp breath but made no sound. Hiding her injured hand behind her, she used her left to gather the remaining fragments and continued her work as though nothing was wrong. Alio was seated at the head of the table, engrossed in a file, his gaze never lifting. Noelle was certain he hadn't noticed. She slipped into the kitchen, ran the wound under cold water, biting her lip to stifle the sting. She found a clean cloth to wrap it for the time being. 5 minutes later, as she washed dishes, Hugo entered. He placed a first aid box on the counter beside her sink without a word. "Boss sent this for you." Then he turned and left. Noelle stared at the box, then glanced through the doorway to the dining room. Alio was still there, his attention fixed on his papers, giving no indication he had just issued that command. He had seen. He had witnessed everything and yet deliberately chose not to look. That single act bewildered Noel far more than any punishment. If he truly despised her, why would he care about a cut on her hand? In the kitchen, during Alio's absences, Bree Whitman and Margot Sinclair would often whisper. Bree, a 25-year-old whose tongue moved faster than her brain, leaned over the spices to ask Margot quietly, "So why not just get rid of her? 95 grand is nothing to him. He could wipe that debt clean with a snap of his fingers. Why keep her around?" Margot, 29 and the longest-serving staff member, dried her hands on her apron. "I don't know," she replied thoughtfully. "But in my 10 years here, I've never seen him let someone stay after they touched one of his forbidden things. Not one." "So, something's different," Bree concluded, her eyes narrowing. "Something is definitely different." Noel, at the sink with her back to them, caught every word. She didn't react, just kept scrubbing, with her left hand, her bandaged right one throbbing with a dull ache. She didn't have an answer to their question. In fact, she didn't dare ask it of herself. The weight of it all had been crushing her. That night, after her work was finally done, Noelle had retreated to her basement cell. Locking the door, she sat on the bed and pulled her mother's wool scarf from her canvas bag. It was frayed and faded, but as she held it, the mansion was finally quiet. The traders were gone, and in the silence, Emilio Ferraro stood alone, the weight of his survival settling in. Down in the basement, a young maid named Noel finally stopped shaking. The storm had passed, leaving two survivors under one roof, each saved by a warning whispered over a phone line. They owed their lives to a bond they didn't even know they shared, a strange connection born from a night of treachery. But this quiet victory was only the end of the story. How had Emilio turned a meticulously planned ambush into a swift, brutal reckoning for his own brother? It began with him putting down his car keys. Instead of walking into a trap, he walked upstairs and opened a drawer he prayed he'd never need again. Inside sat a heavy, dark firearm, a tool for situations where words had failed. He picked up his phone, his movements calm and deliberate. First, he called Hugo, his head of security. Hugo was on the south side, miles away, on a fool's errand. "Come back," Emilio said, his voice flat and cold. "Drop everything. Come back now." There was a pause, then Hugo's reply. "I'm on my way, boss." Hugo recognized the tone, a voice that promised someone wouldn't see the morning. Emilio hung up without another word. "Come." "What about Hugo?" Ford asked, his arms crossed. "Hugo's the real issue," Tristan admitted, turning to Perry. "That's on you." Perry nodded, his voice rapid and exact, like he was reading off stock prices. "I have a fake emergency report for Englewood on the south side. I'll make it look like a snag with one of the smaller shipping lines, the kind of mess Hugo insists on handling himself because he trusts no one else. The alert will go through the internal comm system, not from me directly. It'll look completely authentic. Hugo won't second-guess it." "Are you sure?" Ford pressed. "Positive," Tristan stated firmly. "Problems pop up in the south every month. It's our busiest hub. He'll see the alert, he'll go, and by the time he figures out it's a ghost chase, we'll be done." A brief pause fell. Then Tristan spoke again, his tone heavier, each word deliberate. "Emilio will arrive at the warehouse by himself. No Hugo, no security detail, just him." "And us," Ford added, not as a question, but a statement of fact. "And us," Tristan echoed. "I need 4 of your men inside, hidden and armed. The second Emilio steps in, that door gets locked. It's all over in 5 minutes." Perry swallowed hard, not from fear, but from hearing the unspoken plan finally voiced aloud. Ford didn't so much as flinch. He'd spent 10 years guarding the door, waiting for a seat at the table. 5 minutes was a bargain. "And after?" Ford asked. Tristan faced him, his trademark smile appearing in the garage's darkness. Wide, warm, a smile he'd used for 17 years to earn trust. But in the dim light, The smile revealed itself for what it was, a facade. After, Tristan said, I'm the only Ferraro left. I take it all. The family, the business, everything. Ford, you'll be beside me, not as a guard, but as an advisor. Perry, you'll manage the finances with total autonomy. This changes everything for us. Perry gave a quick, sharp nod, like signing an irreversible deal. Ford simply met Tristan's gaze and said, I'll be ready. Tristan glanced between them, his voice becoming light, but losing none of its edge. He trusts me. He's always trusted his little brother. Emilio looks at me and still sees the 15-year-old kid who hid in a closet the night our mother died. He thinks I'm still that boy. He thinks I still need his protection. Tristan paused, his smile dissolving. And that is his greatest mistake. Not another word was exchanged. Ford and Perry departed the garage minutes apart, their footsteps fading on the gravel. Tristan remained alone, staring up at a second-floor, permanently locked door where he knew his brother was. He stood there for a long moment, and in the deep quiet of the Lake Forest night, no one heard his whisper. I'm sorry, Mom, but Father picked the wrong son. What Tristan and the others didn't realize was that on the other side of the garage wall, separated by a thin sheet of concrete, Noel was in the laundry room. She was there because it was her job. It was nearly 1 in the morning, and her shift didn't end until the last load of laundry was done. And tonight, there was more than usual. The laundry room was in the basement adjacent to the garage, connected by a wall no one had bothered to soundproof during construction, because who would be in there at 1 a.m.? Besides the machines? Noel was folding bath towels when she first heard the voices. Initially, it was just a muffled sound, indistinct, blending with the drone of the washer. She ignored it, but then the machine switched to its rinse cycle. The humming quieted, and in that small window of silence, one word cut through the wall. Emilio. Her hand stopped moving. The towel she was holding slipped and fell to the floor, forgotten. She stood perfectly still, tilting her head to listen. The voices became clearer, not perfectly, but enough for her to know multiple people were on the other side. She crept toward the wall, her steps silent on the concrete. She pressed her ear against its cold surface. The chill seeped into her skin, but it didn't matter because now she could hear them. The warehouse in Pilsen. Hugo won't be there. He'll come alone. Her heart started to pound. She recognized those voices. The first, smooth and controlled, was Tristan. The second, deep and terse, belonged to Ford. The third, quick and clipped, was Perry. She pressed her ear tighter, held her breath, and listened. When Emilio walks in, lock the door. Everything ends in 5 minutes. The only Ferraro left. Each phrase felt like a physical blow. She couldn't process it. His own brother was plotting to have him killed. She felt an urge to pull back, to walk away from the wall and pretend she'd heard nothing, to go back to folding towels and erase it all. She took one step back. Her foot hit something. The water bucket. It tipped, sending water sloshing across the floor with a loud clatter that seemed to explode in the quiet night. Noelle froze. On the other side of the wall, the voices cut off instantly. Dead silence. Then Ford's voice, low and sharp. Is someone there? Noel slapped her hands over her mouth, afraid to even breathe. Her heart hammered against her ribs, so violently she feared they could hear it through the concrete. Heavy footsteps approached, not toward the wall, but circling around to the laundry room door. Ford was coming through the basement hall. Desperate, Noel scanned the small room. The overhead light had burned out ages ago, leaving only the pulsing red glow of the dryer. 2 huge industrial washers stood against one wall. A mountain of clean laundry sat on a table. She dropped to the floor, squeezed herself into the gap behind the largest machine, and hugged her knees to her chest, making herself as small as possible in the shadows. Water from the spilled bucket crept across the floor and soaked her feet, but she didn't dare move. The doorknob turned. The laundry room door swung open. A long rectangle of light from the hallway spilled across the wet floor, stopping less than a foot from her hiding place. Ford stood silhouetted in the doorway. She couldn't see his face, only his massive, threatening shadow. He peered into the room. The machines hummed their steady rhythm. The dryer light blinked red. The clothes lay in a pile. The bucket was on its side. "No one here," Ford said, his voice still wary but losing its edge. "Probably a stray cat got in, or the bucket just tipped." 1 second. 2. 3. The slice of light on the floor shrank as the door closed. The footsteps receded down the hall, up the stairs, and then they were gone. Noel still didn't move. She sat behind the machine in a puddle of freezing water, hands pressed over her mouth, her body racked with uncontrollable shaking. Tears streamed through her fingers, but she made no sound. Not out of bravery, but out of the chilling certainty that if Ford had returned and found her, if he knew what she had heard, she would have never left that basement alive. Noelle had no idea how long she sat there. 10 minutes? Maybe an hour? When she finally forced herself to stand, her legs were stiff and numb from the cold water, and she trembled so badly she had to lean against the washer for support. She slipped out of the laundry room, checked both ways down the empty basement hall, and hurried to her room. She forced each step to be silent, fighting the urge to run from the house, from the city, from a place where murder was whispered through walls at 1 in the morning. She got inside her room, locked the door, and then checked the lock again, before sliding down to the cold floor with her back against the door. She wrapped her arms around her knees and tried to breathe, but her chest was too tight, her head spinning. The words from the garage played on a relentless loop in her mind. The warehouse in Pilsen, no bodyguards, 5 minutes, the only Ferraro left. She covered her ears, but it was useless. The words were already inside her. Noel sat in the darkness as a war raged within her. Tell someone. Tell Emilio. The same man who had banished her to the basement, who forbade her to meet his gaze, who treated her like a piece of furniture he wished to forget. The same man who walked past her, "Good morning, sir," as if she were made of air. What could she possibly say? "Sir, your brother is planning to kill you." Would he ever believe her? A maid drowning in $95,000 of debt? The betrayal hung in the air, thick and final. Emilio stood untouched while his own men secured his brother Tristan, whose face was a canvas of shock and fury. For 17 years, Tristan had been his right hand, the keeper of secrets, the pillar of the family's finances. Now, he was just a traitor, exposed by a single last-minute phone call. But as Emilio looked past the ruin of his brother, his thoughts were not on the man born of the same parents. They were on the whispered warning from an unknown voice. It came from a debtor, a woman he had relegated to the shadows of his basement, the one responsible for breaking the most precious thing he owned. He had every reason to disbelieve her, yet he did. If he hadn't, Tristan would have won, and she would have been silenced forever. A person who knew too much, with no power to protect themselves, usually had only one fate. Yet, she had chosen to speak. He replayed the moment in his mind, the chilling clarity of the warning that saved his life. What if she had stayed silent? What if she'd pretended she heard nothing, just gone back to her menial tasks, head bowed, letting fate unfold? This Saturday, he would have walked into that warehouse alone and never walked out. He asked himself a question he knew she must have asked herself. Did he deserve to be saved by her? He had banished her to the basement, forced her to work 19 hours a day, and looked right through her as if she were made of glass. He had stripped her of the last shreds of her dignity after she had already lost her mother, her home, everything. Did he deserve her risking her life? In the cold silence after the storm, her mother's worn wool scarf came to his mind, the one she clutched like a prayer. It was her mother's voice, not his, that had guided her. The warm, clear, steady voice from a better time, the one that always told her what to do when she was lost. Always do what's right, Noelle. Even when it hurts. Even when you're afraid. Those were the words that had echoed in her mind, the legacy of a woman named Ruth. That's how you keep yourself. You can lose money, lose your home, lose everything, but if you lose who you are, nothing can bring that back. Noel's grip on that old scarf had been her anchor. The faint smell of lavender, a ghost of comfort, had mingled with her tears, but they weren't tears of fear anymore. "I can't let him die, Mom," she had whispered into the worn fabric. "Even if he hates me, even if he pretends I don't exist, I can't know someone is walking into a trap this Saturday and do nothing." If she chose silence, who would she be? The decision was made, but the execution was a desperate gamble. She had no direct line to Emilio. All she had was Hugo's emergency number, useless now that Perry's scheme had sent him to the city's south side. Hugo wouldn't be there. He wouldn't answer. She needed Emilio's number. Then, a fragile memory surfaced. Last week, while cleaning his first-floor office, she'd accidentally opened a desk drawer. Inside was a thin internal directory bound in black leather. Her eyes had caught a glimpse of a page before she could look away. Emilio's name next to a string of numbers. She hadn't dared to write it down, but 4 digits had burned into her memory because they were her mother's birthday. December 23rd. 1, 2, 2, 3. She could never forget that date. Those 4 numbers, attached to the internal prefix she knew from Hugo's line, were a long shot. It could be wrong, but it was the only chance she had. After placing the scarf back on her pillow, as if saying goodbye to her mother one last time, she steeled herself. "I'll do what's right, Mom, even when it hurts," she had vowed. She knew that on this Saturday night, as the house slept and Emilio walked toward the Pilsen warehouse, she would slip into the basement, dial those 4 numbers, and pray the man on the other end would listen. The 3 days leading up to this moment had felt like 3 years. Her body went through the motions, mopping, washing, cleaning, but her mind was trapped in the laundry room, hearing Tristan's chilling words on a loop. The only Ferraro left. She couldn't eat or sleep. The image of the dark warehouse and the sound of phantom gunshots haunted her. And now, Saturday night had arrived, wrapping the mansion in an eerie silence. It wasn't the usual quiet of a well-run house, but a heavy, charged stillness, like the air before a devastating storm. Everyone had retreated. Bree, Margot, the entire staff had vanished, leaving the basement and first floor empty. Only a dim hall light and the relentless ticking of a clock remained, marking the seconds to midnight. Upstairs, Emilio stood before his mirror, dressed in a black suit and shirt, no tie. He adjusted his collar, his expression as blank as it had been for 17 years. The pistol at his side was a familiar weight, a tool of his trade he carried as casually as other men carried a wallet. His phone buzzed, a text from Tristan. "Everything's ready, brother. Big deal tonight. The partner is waiting in Pilsen. I'll be there ahead of time to prepare." Emilio read it with a slight nod. Tristan was always meticulous, always a step ahead. It was why he'd entrusted the family's finances to his younger brother without a second thought, believing blood was the ultimate bond. The phone buzzed again, this time a call. It was Hugo, his voice tight. "Boss, the contact on the south side is reporting a problem. The Englewood shipment is in trouble. I need to check it myself." Emilio's brow furrowed. Trouble in Englewood wasn't new, but the timing was terrible, clashing with the Pilsen deal. "Tonight?" he asked. "They're saying it's urgent, boss. If we wait, we could lose the whole shipment." Emilio considered for a moment. Hugo was his most trusted man. If he called it urgent, it was. And Englewood required his authority. "Go," Emilio commanded. "I'll handle the warehouse myself." A beat of hesitation came over the line. Hugo, standing by his car, gripped his keys, his jaw tight. In 17 years, he had never let Emilio go to a deal alone. "Boss, let me handle it and come back, or send someone else." "Go." The single word was quiet, yet it carried an authority that left no room for argument. Yes, boss. The call ended. Hugo drove off toward the south side, straight into a trap he didn't know existed. Emilio pocketed his phone, grabbed his car keys, and gave his gun one last habitual check. Not out of concern, but out of routine. He then walked out of his bedroom and down the hall, his steps halting before a locked oak door at the very end. He never opened it, not since the day the music box broke. He just stood there, and for a fleeting second, his mask slipped. Anyone watching closely would have seen he wasn't looking at the door, but through it, at the shattered melody on the table inside, at a lullaby forever silenced. Then the moment passed. He turned and descended the stairs, his black shoes making a steady, confident rhythm on the marble, the sound of a man walking unknowingly toward his own grave. At the bottom of the stairs, kneeling by the back door, Noel held a rag, her head bowed low. She heard his approach before she saw him, the crisp sound of shoes on stone, the faint jingle of keys, the front door opening. She looked up just enough to see his silhouette pass, black suit, straight back, moving with purpose toward the garage, the car, and the warehouse in Pilsen. Her heart plummeted. Her fingers clenched the rag so tightly that cold water dripped unnoticed onto the floor. "It's happening," she breathed, her voice a tremor she could barely hear. "Tonight. It's all happening tonight." The sound of an engine turning over echoed from the garage. He was leaving. If she didn't act in this very second, he was gone for good. Noelle dropped the rag and ran, not walked, not hurried. She flew, her bare feet silent on the cold marble, down the hall and into the darkness of the basement. Model. His second call was to a number he knew by heart, but never wrote down. A line reserved for nights that ended in blood. The other end picked up instantly. "Gather the team," Emilio commanded, his voice as still as the air before a hurricane. "Pilsen warehouse tonight, quietly." He had been warned. The hunted had become the hunter. But this calculated response, this chilling reversal of fortune, was only possible because of a call he almost didn't answer just minutes earlier. A call from a number he didn't recognize, from a voice trembling with fear, a voice that changed everything. He had been walking toward the garage when his secure phone vibrated. The screen showed no name, only a flashing red alert. Internal intercom, basement level. It was almost midnight. His first instinct was to ignore it. His finger hovered over the decline button, but 2 decades in his world taught him that calls at the wrong hour often deliver the most vital news. He answered with a single impatient word: "Speak." On the other end, a thin, fragile voice rushed out, on the verge of breaking. "Sir, please don't go to the warehouse tonight." A profound silence followed. "Who is this?" Emilio's voice was slow and deliberate. "Noel. Noel Ashford, the maid." Another pause, longer this time. Noel held her breath, expecting him to hang up and walk out to his waiting car, sealing his fate. But he didn't. When he spoke again, the ice in his tone was gone, replaced by a sharp, focused attention. "You have 30 seconds. That was all the opening she needed. The story she told him wasn't born from that moment of panic, but from a secret she had carried for 3 agonizing days. A secret she'd overheard by pure chance. It had happened on Wednesday night. 3 men had gathered in the garage, their voices low and confident in the darkness. Tristan, his own brother, had arrived first. Then came the imposing figure of Ford Bellini, followed by the slinking shadow of Perry Rizzo. They didn't waste time on greetings. "This Saturday," Tristan had declared, laying out the plan. A fake deal at the old warehouse, a meeting Emilio would feel compelled to attend personally. "When it's done," Noel had heard Tristan say through the thin walls separating the laundry room from the garage, "Tristan will be the only Ferraro left." But Emilio didn't ask about the plot. He asked something else entirely. Why? His voice was a near whisper, not with suspicion, but genuine bewilderment. "Why are you saving me?" Noelle broke then, the tears finally coming as she explained. "Because my mother taught me that when you can save a life, you don't ask if they deserve it. You just save them." She took a ragged breath. "And because if your mother were alive, she wouldn't want you to die like this, not by your brother's hand." The words hung in the silence, and then Emilio's voice returned, steady and clear. "Lock your door. Don't come out. I'll handle it." That call was a desperate last resort. Just before midnight, her heart had been hammering against her ribs. She had first tried dialing Hugo, her only emergency contact, but his phone went straight to voicemail, once, then twice. She could hear the low rumble of an engine from the garage. Emilio was about to leave. She closed her eyes, her mind racing, landing on a memory from the internal staff directory. A private number. The last 4 digits were 1, 2, 3. It was a long shot, a desperate guess based on a number seared into her memory. December 23rd, her own mother's birthday. Her fingers trembled as she keyed in the 4-digit bypass extension. She misdialed twice, her panic making her clumsy. Finally, she pressed call. It was a choice born of pure instinct, a final attempt to stop a tragedy she had no business knowing about. She was just a maid, new to the house, a quiet girl who kept to herself. But she was also a daughter who missed her mother, living under the same roof as a son who secretly did the same. And it was that shared, silent grief that had made her notice the numbers in the first place. And that's how it all began. Two people, separated by floors and status, bound by a sorrow neither knew the other carried. In the basement, a girl held a frayed scarf. On the second floor, a man touched a broken box. Two keepsakes, two identical heartaches, existing in parallel. In that quiet mansion, while one grieved and the other unknowingly drove his own brother to plot against him, neither had any idea that their two separate worlds were about to collide in the most violent way imaginable. Ah, so that's how it was. The 5 words on the screen glowed in the darkness of the basement. "It's done. You were right." Noelle read the text message again and again, her tear-blurred eyes struggling to focus. She was huddled on the cold concrete, clutching her mother's old wool scarf, not knowing if Alio was alive or dead. Every sound from outside had been torture, but now, with a single vibration from her phone, the agonizing wait was over. Relief, so powerful it felt like collapsing, washed over her. She knew, in that instant, that her warning had been heard, and that Alio was safe. What Noelle felt as relief, Alio experienced as a profound emptiness. He stood alone in the center of the vast, silent warehouse. The headlights that had cut through the gloom were now gone, plunging the space into near darkness. His shadow, once long and imposing, had vanished with the light. He gave no orders, called for no one. He simply stood there, a victor with nothing to celebrate. He had just saved his own life, but in doing so, he had lost the only other person in the world who shared his last name. The price of his life had been his brother's banishment. Hugo had led Tristan out into the night, his steps heavy, his head hung low. Tristan hadn't fought, hadn't spoken another word. He just walked away from the warehouse, from the city, from his life, and never looked back. Ford and Perry were dealt with soon after. No one dared ask what that meant. Some answers were never meant to be heard. Alio had watched his brother go, his final words hanging in the cold air. "If you come back, next time I won't talk." It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. That final chilling promise came only after Tristan had offered himself up for death. He had spread his arms wide, his chest exposed, daring Alio to pull the trigger. "Do it," he had said, his voice brittle. But when Alio looked at him, he didn't see the man who had just tried to kill him. He saw the boy who shared their mother's eyes, the 15-year-old he hadn't been able to protect all those years ago. In that moment, the boss vanished, and only an older brother remained, faced with an impossible choice. The decision was rooted not in anger, but in a shared, devastating history. "You think I wanted this life?" Alio had asked, his voice quiet and heavy with a sadness no one there had ever heard. He spoke of the night their mother died, of the blood on his shirt at 19, of losing his youth and his ability to trust. He spoke of the nightmares that never left him. He paused, his gaze fixed on Tristan. "And now," he said, the words landing like stones, "I've lost you too." That confession of pain was Alio's answer to a torrent of suppressed fury. After 17 years of smiling obedience, something inside Tristan had finally snapped. "You took everything," he had roared, his voice echoing off the metal roof. "Father chose you. It was always you." He paced, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with unshed tears. "What was I? A shadow. For 17 years, just a shadow walking behind you." He was a son of the Ferraro family, yet he had never felt like one. The outburst had shattered a silence that was heavier than any bullet. The two brothers stood just 3 feet apart, caught in the harsh glare of the SUV's headlights, their faces stripped of all pretense. They weren't a boss and his underling. They were just two boys who had once shared a room, now separated by a chasm of betrayal. It was Tristan who broke the silence first, his voice tight as he tried to maintain control. "How long have you known?" he asked, a faint tremor betraying his calm facade. He asked because his entire world had just collapsed. The signal he was about to give, the one that would have ended his brother's life, never left his hand. Suddenly, the darkness behind him erupted as Alio's men poured in from the river entrance, a perfectly executed counter-ambush. Ford was slammed to the concrete, 10 years of loyalty ending with his face in the dust. Perry simply raised his hands, his face ashen, choosing to surrender without a fight. The trap had been turned on its master, and just minutes before that chaos, the warehouse was still. Tristan waited with his men, the plan in motion. From the end of the road, 2 beams of light sliced through the night, steady and familiar. A black SUV with a license plate he knew by heart. "Alio is always on time," Ford noted, his voice calm. A small, triumphant smile touched Tristan's lips as he watched the vehicle approach. "Exactly on time," he whispered, confident that his brother was driving straight into his doom, never imagining that a phone call had already sealed his own. "Thank God," she whispered, her voice breaking as she clutched the phone and scarf to her chest. Unrestrained tears of pure relief streamed down her face. The nightmare was over. But that release was born from a morning so tense it felt like the entire Lake Forest estate was holding its breath. The sun had risen slowly, hesitating to shine on a house where the previous night's events still lingered in the air. The silence was different. Not the usual heavy quiet, but something lighter, like a long-held sigh. It was the aftermath of a plan set in motion by 5 simple words on her screen. "It's done. You were right." That text was why she'd been up at 5 a.m. as always, running on pure habit after a sleepless night. She'd stared into the small mirror in her basement room at a pale woman with swollen red eyes, whose hands trembled while fastening the buttons of her shirt, completely unaware of what the day would hold. She only knew she was facing a crossroads, a reward for her courage or dismissal for knowing too much. It was why her hands moved automatically, cleaning the kitchen while her mind was miles away, replaying the secret call to that warehouse in Pilsen. And then, footsteps behind her broke the quiet. It was Hugo, standing in the doorway, his face as unreadable as ever. But his eyes were different. He wasn't looking at the maid anymore. He was looking at a woman he had completely underestimated. "The boss wants to see you in the sitting room," he said. Noel placed the dish towel on the counter. Her heart pounded, but her expression remained calm. She wiped her hands on her apron, nodded, and understood that it all began with a terrible feeling she couldn't ignore. In the quiet Chicago apartment, sunlight painted long stripes across the floor. Noel stood by the window, a small new music box open in her hands. The melody that drifted out was a quiet promise kept, a sound she never thought she'd hear again. It had arrived just days ago, a small, unsigned package that signaled the true end of one life and the start of another. This peace, this light, this home, it all felt like a dream. But it was real. And it all began because she chose to make a phone call that could have cost her everything. This quiet moment was the aftermath of a storm she had barely survived. It was the result of a debt paid, a forgiveness granted, and a trust unexpectedly earned. The melody played on, a testament to the fact that even in the darkest places, a single act of courage could change the entire world. But freedom hadn't been immediate. Just a month ago, she had stood before Alio, the papers that cleared her $95,000 debt in her trembling hands, and she had asked to stay. Not as a servant, not as a prisoner, but as a person. She had seen the profound loneliness in him after his brother Tristan's betrayal, a loss deeper than death, and recognized it as a mirror of her own grief. She told him no one should have to face that kind of emptiness alone. The cavernous house needed a human presence, not just servants. He looked at her then, truly looked, and the faintest shadow of a smile, the first she'd ever seen, touched his lips. He called her the strangest person he'd ever met. And in that moment, the power dynamic that had defined their existence shattered completely. That conversation was possible only because of what had happened the night before. He had summoned her to the sitting room, the air thick with unspoken words. He admitted he hadn't slept, not because of his brother's treachery, but because of her. He finally confessed to the cruelty he had shown her, condemning her to the basement, working her to exhaustion, looking through her as if she were invisible. He acknowledged that he had turned her one mistake into a prolonged sentence. Then, his voice low, he admitted that she, with every reason to let him walk into a trap and perish, had chosen to save him. Her tears finally fell when she explained her mother's guiding principle. You don't question if a life is worth saving. You just save it. His own eyes had closed for a brief second, a flicker of profound pain crossing his face. He whispered that his mother used to say the same thing. It was in that shared grief, that common memory of their lost mothers, that they finally saw each other not as master and servant, but as two lonely people bound by loss. That's when he placed the thick envelope on the table. Inside was the formal release of her debt, a check large enough to fund her entire nursing education at UIC for 2 years, and the deed to a safe apartment in Lakeview. He was setting her free, giving her a future she thought she had lost forever. He told her she was the only person he could trust, precisely because she had acted with nothing to gain. While everyone else in his life operated out of fear or ambition, she had acted out of principle. His mother had taught him to judge people not by their station, but by what they do when no one is watching and there is no reward. Noel's call, an act of pure, selfless humanity, had earned his complete trust. Her quiet integrity had pierced through years of his hardened cynicism. She was free to go, to leave the Ferraro family and their dark world behind her forever. And what was that single act? On the night of his brother's betrayal, Noel had overheard the final details of a deadly ambush meant for Alio. Every part of her screamed to stay silent. This man had been her tormentor. He deserved whatever was coming to him. It would be justice. But her mother's voice echoed louder than her desire for revenge. She found a hidden phone and made the call, her voice trembling but clear, laying out the time, the place, and the people involved. She gave him the truth without asking for anything, expecting nothing more than to be punished for her audacity. She simply did what she believed was right, a belief that had been tested in the cruelest ways. Before that night, her life in the mansion was a nightmare. Alio's gaze was ice. His commands were absolute. He saw her as nothing more than a symbol of her mistake, a walking debt to be collected through labor and humiliation. He made sure she was isolated, exhausted, and always reminded of her place. The cavernous house wasn't a home, It was a beautifully furnished prison where she paid for her transgression day after day, with no end in sight. She was completely alone, haunted by the memory of the person she had lost and the life she had been forced to abandon. Hugo, his stoic head of security, drove her from the estate a month later, after her self-imposed stay was over. As she stood by the gates with the same canvas bag she'd arrived with, Hugo spoke three simple words that felt heavier than 1,000. "You're a good person." She didn't look back at the house, but Alio was there, watching from a window, until her car was just a speck disappearing beyond the oak trees. He remained there long after she was gone, standing in the quiet, empty mansion that she had, for a brief time, made a little less lonely. And how did it all begin? Weeks earlier, a grieving Noel, new to the city and desperate for work to pay off a crushing family debt, had taken a job as a cleaner in the vast Ferraro estate. On her third day, while dusting in the private library, her hands trembled as she reached for a delicate antique music box on the mantelpiece, Alio's last memento of his beloved mother. It slipped, falling to the marble floor and shattering into a dozen pieces. And in that instant, a single clumsy mistake sealed her fate, turning a man she had never met into her judge, jury, and jailer. The melody was the same, its notes clear and sad, spinning through her small Lakeview apartment. A brand new music box sat before Noelle, a gift just unwrapped. Tucked inside was a handwritten note. For the girl who heard the music and didn't walk away. E. She looked from the elegant script to her mother's scarf on the wall, and finally let the tears fall. They weren't tears of grief or fear, but of profound relief. She had made it through the darkest chapter of her life, and she was still here, still whole. At that exact moment, across town at the Lake Forest estate, Alio sat in his mother's room at the end of the second-floor hall. For the first time in 17 years, the door was unlocked. On the table, a specialist had repaired the old music box. Scars of cracked wood remained, and its tune was slower, rougher, like a voice hoarse from crying. As the lullaby his mother once sang filled the candlelit room, his own eyes grew wet. It wasn't for the pain of the past, but because someone had finally looked past the feared boss, the ghost of the estate, and had seen him, Alio. The lonely son, the grieving brother. Someone had seen the truth of him, and she hadn't run away. This quiet peace was possible only because the person he had overlooked had saved his life, and the one he had trusted most had wanted him dead. It's a strange thing how loyalty sometimes comes not from blood or power, but from the person with nothing to gain. Noel was that person. She had been just a shadow in the background, someone nobody noticed. But she was the one who overheard the whispers of a plot, the careful planning of his downfall by his closest confidant. She could have stayed quiet, could have saved herself from the terrifying risk, but she chose to do what was right, even knowing it could cost her everything. This entire story hinges on the moment she decided not to walk away. And it all started so simply. A new girl, hired at the grand estate, just trying to do her job and remain invisible. Then one day, she heard a faint, sorrowful melody drifting from behind a locked door on the second floor. That was it. That was the beginning. What did this story make you feel? Have you ever had someone in your life who you didn't truly see, only to realize later they were the one who mattered most? Share your thoughts below. Your story could be an inspiration. If this moved you, please hit the like button and share it with someone who needs this message today. And subscribe so you don't miss the next story. Your support helps me continue this work. I wish you all health, joy, and peace. Thank you for being here. Goodbye, and see you next time. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.